Hi, y'all. Okay, so for this week, I'm essentially having you learn how to be an anthropologist, and how to conduct research. And for you to do that, you kind of, first and foremost, need to know a little bit about the background of anthropology, how it developed, particularly as a method and field, as well as how to be an anthropologist, what that looks like, why anthropologists keep field journals, why I'm having you keep field journals. What purpose do they fulfill for anthropologists, and for researchers more broadly, and how they conduct ethnographic research? So, getting into it, I'm going to share my screen. Hold on. Okay, now I can share my screen. Sorry about that. Okay, there we go. Now I can move it. Okay, so I'm gonna briefly discuss the developing field of anthropology, as well as go through some crucial anthropologists, that are kind of, well, pretty important to the field, and also understand where it began. So, to begin with, anthropology began as a study of human difference. I discussed this at, I believe, my first lecture or second lecture video. Um, Early theorists especially focused on racial differences. And you further saw anthropologists develop the term race from that. Carl Linnaeus uh, began to classify humans in a natural order. In other words, he was one of the anthropologists that began to understand race in terms of racial categories and tying it to human beings. Monogenism is the doctrine or belief that all human races descended from a single created pair. It's the understanding of Adam and Eve, versus polygenism, the doctrine or belief that existing human races evolved from two or more distinct ancestral types. This justified, so polygenism further justified arguments for slavery, genocide, and the like, because within polygenism, um, certain anthropologists took it a step further to identify superior human species versus inferior human species. Again, when you look at the history of anthropology, a lot of the early history of anthropology, unfortunately, is rooted in racism. So keep that in mind when you are conducting your own research within this field. So early 19th century figures were Charles Darwin, who discussed natural selection and the process of natural selection. Within this, he uh, really develops how animals are essentially, there's dominant animals, and there are animals that will eventually be consumed by those dominant animals, leading to natural selection in that process. And you also have Charles Lyell, who discusses uniformitarianism. Um, those researchers are very crucial because they influenced later anthropologists like Herbert Spencer in a lot of his writings. Herbert Spencer especially took a lot of inspiration from Charles Darwin. For Herbert Spencer, he read Charles Darwin's work and was like, not only do animals function like this, but so do humans. And so he is a philosopher, evolutionist, and political theorist. He believed in the survival of the fittest, that only the fittest shall survive within a given society. And this fittest, he further defines as superior. And then those who are dominated by the fittest are the inferior within a society. He also justified the aspects of dividing people in this way, especially racial divisions. So again, keep that in mind when you're researching these theorists. Um, Again, he practiced social Darwinism. Lewis Henry Morgan is the principal founder of scientific anthropology. He developed the field in a lot of ways. And his work led to social cultural evolution and the understanding of sociocultural evolution. In this, again, he's really heavily relying on these early theorists. He he posits that there is an evolution of where people of a group start out as barbaric to savage and then become more civilized and civil within a society. And he particularly focused on Native Americans in a lot of his writing. Looking back at his writing, a lot of, if not all, anthropologists disagree with the conclusions that he comes up with because he particularly highlights barbaric nature in a broad way. He further attaches barbaric nature to those of particular racial and ethnic backgrounds. And he further attaches those who are civilized to racial and ethnic backgrounds. And when he does this, he more so attached those who are barbaric to Native American people, Black people, this goes on, and those who are civilized to white people, or those who are considered more white than other groups of people. He came up with the unilinear cultural evolution. In this, he starts off with a society evolves over time, starting with promiscuity, into savagery, into barbarism, and ending with civilization and becoming more civilized. Anthropologists further disagree with his assessment of cultures because it's not how early societies functioned, if at all. We have recorded history that early societies um, had laws, had morals, had thoughts, had norms. Early African societies, for example, had early development of laws and a structured system. And so a lot of anthropologists consider this early work as completely inaccurate, and it doesn't actually represent many cultures. Franz Boas reacted to these early anthropologists, and he disagreed with them. He studied the Eskimo culture and native peoples of British Columbia. He established anthropology as an academic discipline in the United States. Part of this is he also establishes it as a field of research, which is very important to Franz Boas. He writes a lot about how anthropologists should conduct research and what that looks like. He further highlights how we should interact with our participants or subjects, and what that relationship looks like within our field research. He argued against sociocultural evolution, stating that such a view of culture was ethnocentric. And this was the first emergence of the term ethnocentric. He is the one that developed it. Margaret Mead worked under Franz Boas. She was a pupil um, of him. And so she is considered the mother of anthropology. She has a lot of writings. She's a very interesting researcher. She's also considered a sociologist, but primarily a lot of her field work is anthropological based. She focused on child rearing practices. She took it a step further to compare and contrast the child rearing practices um, of Native American people and the like to her own culture, which was American culture and of her time. And she actually was critiquing American culture while she was looking at other cultures and what they did in raising their children. And that was a lot of her research and writings. She furthermore challenged the idea that there are biological differences between sexes and instead highlighted social aspects, how we are taught to conduct ourselves given our gender and what that might look like, and how we are taught given the sex that we are born with and the like, and how we are socialized through that process, and how that might look from culture to culture. And there's a really good video on Margaret Mead on YouTube. I highly recommend watching it. If you're interested in her field work, you want to learn more about it, highly recommend it. Bronislaw Malinowski, hope I'm saying that first name right, is considered the founding father of British social anthropology. So he primarily developed the field within Britain and the like. So he pioneered the modern fieldwork methods, how we consider our research participants, as well as what the process of observation looks like, how we conduct research, what questions do we need to ask, how do we build up rapport, an important term I'll be teaching you later, with our given subjects, participants, right? Or if you want to define them a different way, friends within our research. He also revised ethnographic writings. And so he really developed further the method of ethnographic research here. He also further discusses a lot of field journal writing and what exactly that should look like for anthropologists and how they should approach it. Ruth Fulton Benedict is another important anthropologist, worked under Margaret Mead. She was the president of the American Anthropological Association, conducted research on Native American culture. She also conducted research alongside Margaret Mead. They have a couple of writings together. And according to her, a culture, like an individual, is a more or less consistent pattern or thought in action, which I really like that quote. It's really getting at the patterns of behavior that can be seen within a culture, how we conduct ourselves, right? And how we are taught further how to conduct ourselves. It's consistent. It's done over and over and over again. Um, George Murdoch is another famous anthropologist. He studied hundreds of different cultures around the world to determine if they had a common trait or value. I believe I've already talked about him before. If I haven't, then I haven't. But he found that there are common traditions or practices, but these traditions and practices are usually conducted differently. So we can consistently see that um, every culture has funerals, and they know, historically speaking, how to dispose of their dead, right? But there are specific ceremonies that differ from culture to culture in how they dispose of their dead. Same with weddings. There are different ceremonies that differ from culture to culture on how they conduct a wedding ceremony. What the bride wears, what the groom wears, what the partners wear, right? And what that might look like given that culture. You have dances that differ from culture to culture. You have families that differ from culture to culture, where you see different family structures form in a given culture and society. Cooking differs, food differs regionally speaking and locally speaking, and even can be more specific. You can even have specific food that is that is found, for example, in America. Midwestern food completely differs sometimes from Southern food, and certain recipes completely differ from given where you're at within America or France or the like, right? Anthropological thought today is a rejection on of the evolutionist thoughts. Anthropologists reject these early thoughts on race and culture, especially with making sweeping generalizations about a culture, as well as the ethnocentric thought that there are universal stages of development. And third, that all cultures are the same, when in fact they are diverse and unique and complex. The scientific approach seeks to discover the general forces that make cultures the way that they are. It is a way, it helps to explain life and how people conduct themselves. It also helps to measure certain stuff accurately. It makes sure that you conduct repetitive, valid research by following the scientific approach and method. Okay, so I'm going to talk about a couple of approaches. The first one is the humanistic approach. It is an orientation that rejects that of any single theory, and that rejects that any single theory can explain cultural differences, and similarities and cultural changes. Essentially, stating that there are multiple theories that can be applied to explain a given culture, and there should be multiple theories that can be applied here. Interpretive anthropology emphasizes the uniqueness in each culture. Um, According to one textbook, according to Peoples, that's the author's last name for this quote. The job of the anthropologist is not to explain elements of a culture, but to explicate one element through others. Seeing how so for this, anthropologists are essentially seeing how things make sense given their unique context, right? So looking at social aspects, norms, values, behaviors, attitudes, looking at historical context, which is also important, looking at the language, how that ties into the historical context, right? All of these elements are very, very important for interpretive anthropologists and how to research culture. Postmodernism is a philosophical viewpoint, emphasizing the relativity of all knowledge, including science, focuses on how the knowledge of a particular time and place is constructed, especially on how power relations affect the creation and spread of ideas and beliefs. This was introduced in the 1980s. Scientific knowledge should be subjective as well as objective, according to postmodernists, to a particular cultural tradition. It's very similar to constructionist theory here. And then this is kind of getting into each of these approaches and comparing, contrasting scientific versus humanistic. For the most part, anthropology has moved towards humanistic approaches. and started off with scientific approaches, but both are important here to the field of anthropology, and I think that's important to note. Anthropologists can study culture for a number of reasons, but it's important to note that you should do certain things as an anthropologist. First one is that our subjects is to understand that our subjects are conscious beings, aware of their own behavior, values, and beliefs. Um, they aren't, I know that I've used participants and subjects as a term, but they aren't to be treated as numbers here or to be reduced to their culture because you have a lot to learn when you conduct ethnographic research or observe particular groups just by talking to them and engaging with them. And so it's important to acknowledge that fact that these people have agency, they have choice, they understand their behavior, and trying to explain their behavior to them when you're an outsider will most likely be will most likely come off as rather rude. Anthropologists also observe people living their everyday lives, what they're doing on an everyday basis, because that is important. I know when you're hearing that, you're like, I can't imagine someone observing me in my everyday life. It might be boring. Um, it might be boring, right? But you think that, but someone else could learn a lot just by observing you in your everyday life and how you conduct yourselves, because a lot is there. And we don't really notice that because we're so embedded in that sort of day-to-day experience. And so it doesn't stick out to us. Cultural anthropology, last to note, is among one of the most diverse fields, making it almost impossible for anthropologists to reach theoretical consensus. Essentially saying that everything goes within anthropology, except for um, the early theorists and what they were talking about. Except for that. Um, but it's very hard for anthropologists to reach a consensus on explaining culture, which makes it, again, a very diverse field. And you can learn a lot from these theorists and how they approach studying their participants and the like. Okay, that is essentially, let me exit out of this stop share. That was essentially an introduction to the development of anthropology. I'll get into more specifics with the next lecture video, with how to conduct field work, what exactly that looks like, what research methods look like for uh, cultural anthropologists and anthropologists, because all of that will be very crucial in your not only discussion questions, right, but also day-to-day life. Being able to observe and paying attention to the world around you. So, um, sorry. Um, I'll see you. I won't see you physically, but I will post that lecture video. So, have a great week.